So first, maybe we could just take a moment to pause and consider what if Earth lost 25% of its terrestrial biodiversity? What if Earth lost a carbon sink that amounts for 15% of anthropogenic emissions of CO2, or a water pump that accounts for about 10% of global evapotranspiration? Or what if Earth lost 390 billion trees, roughly the same number as the number of stars in the Milky Way, or the number of microbes in a spoonful of good Iowa soil? This is what Earth would look like with the loss of the Amazon rainforest. But this would be crazy to think, right? We're not going to lose the Amazon rainforest. Well, it turns out that in the year 2000, a climate model simulation came out. It was published as at that time quite an advanced climate model, a couple land, atmosphere, ocean. And this climate model predicted that by the end of the century, the Amazon rainforest would in fact collapse. We'd lose the forest, and instead we'd be left with grassland and savanna in place of the rainforest. And this is not because of deforestation. This was not because of humans going in and cutting down the forest, but rather this was because this particular model predicted that rainfall would dramatically increase in the Amazon over the coming century, and there would be subsequent to that, not enough rainfall to support a forest in the Amazon. Okay, and so is this reasonable? Is this something that we still might think would actually happen? It's worth investigation if this is the hypothesis of one possible outcome. And if this is indeed a possible outcome, I would argue that this does have specific relevance to Catholics. I have a quote here from the Catechism, but really Sister Damien Marie's talk this morning was a better introduction to this than any that I could give here for you today. And so I'll just give you a preview of the main message of what I hope you might take out of this. So yes, I do think that over the coming century, tropical forests will be extremely responsive to drought. We might see a lot of mortality of trees, but the effects will be highly species specific. I think that the overall message that's been coming through so far over the past decade or two is that we will continue to have tropical forests, but they might be novel in terms of their species composition and their structure. And so for outline of what I'll talk about, so first some theory. I'll try to at least present some ideas of how drought kills trees. Why is it that trees die when subject to drought? Then I'll provide some observational evidence of drought kill, that is when droughts kill trees, from a study site that I'm involved with in Costa Rica, as well as study sites throughout the Amazon. Then I'll get into some experimental evidence of drought kill, primarily in the Amazon, and then model predictions from mechanistic predictive models that may be predicting whether or not we'll see a lot of tree death because of droughts over the next century. So first, theory. And this theory is based on a carbon-water trade-off in plants. And so this is fundamental. Plants need carbon dioxide to carry out photosynthesis, but leaves are generally impermeable to carbon dioxide. And so this is a problem. How do you get carbon dioxide from the atmosphere to the photosynthetic apparatus inside a leaf? Well, the way that generally happens is that leaves have small pores or stomata that allow gas transfer between the atmosphere and the inside of the leaf. And these stomata, these pores, can open and close. When they're open, carbon dioxide could enter the leaf. However, they could also close, and when they close, carbon dioxide cannot enter the leaf. And so it would be highly advantageous from one perspective to have these pores open all the time so that plants could get a lot of CO2. But there's a trade-off. And the trade-off is that plants lose water through these pores. So these pores allow gas exchange in general. It's not just that CO2 could come in, but also that that plant tissues could dry out, that water could evaporate and pass through these stomata. In order to regulate that water loss, in order to limit that water loss, stomata shut. And so this water loss through stomata is actually what drives the flow of water through the entire plant. Water is a polar molecule. Water is sticky. Water molecules are held together by cohesive forces. And as water evaporates through the stomata in the leaves, it's connected via these hydrogen bonds to a whole chain of water molecules, a whole unbroken chain of water molecules reaching from the leaf, through the stem, through the roots, all the way to the soil. And so the tug is at the leaf, but there's this continuous pull throughout the entire plant. If this water column that reaches throughout the entire plant were to be disrupted, the leaves would be hydraulically disconnected from the soil. They would have no way to pull up water from the soil. The only reason why they're able to pull up water is because of this water column that's hydrogen bonded and linked all the way down to the soil. And so plants really do not want their water columns to be disrupted. Once they are, they're extremely difficult or impossible to repair. Now, if plants start losing too much water through their stomata, if there's too much pull at the top and there's not enough water at the bottom to supply this through the loss of water, to make up for the loss of water through stomata, you could have pretty severe pressure drops inside the plant's circulatory system. And when you get these pressure drops, air bubbles could enter into the plant's circulatory system. And when air bubbles do enter the plant's circulatory system, they expand. And the image shows on the right-hand side vessels in a plant leaf where an air bubble has entered and expanded, and all of those vessels on the right-hand side are now hydraulically dysfunctional. They're disconnected from the soil. And if this happens writ large throughout a whole plant, the plant will die. Plants have various mechanisms to prevent these air embolisms. And first and foremost is what I mentioned before. Plants could simply shut their stomata. And when they shut their stomata, they're no longer losing water. And as long as they shut their stomata in time, they could save themselves from these air bubbles getting into their circulatory system and expanding, and this hydraulic dysfunction. There are other anatomical features that could help plants avoid the problem of drying up, like these torus margo structures on the right-hand side here. And trees could also just drop their leaves. And so the photos are from a tropical forest in Costa Rica, where during the wet season everything's green, dry season you have a lot of things that are brown, and that's because there's no water available, so plants drop their leaves. So second part of talk is observational evidence of drought kill in Costa Rica and Amazonia. First, Costa Rica. So the 2015 El Nino event was associated with an extreme drought in much of Central America, parts of Mexico, parts of South America as well. And the little star on the map shows the study site where my group has worked in northwestern Costa Rica. 2015 had the lowest rainfall in the observational record, although the observational record at this site does only go back to 1980. And so we wondered what would happen to the trees following this most severe drought on record. And what we found was that tree mortality rates were 2 to 3 times higher following the severe drought than in other years. Bars show tree mortality rates from 2019 through 2009 to through 2017. Baseline rates of mortality are around 1-2% per year. So about 1-2% of the trees on the landscape will die in any given year. But in 2015, mortality shot up to around 6 or 7%, which was the highest that we've observed. Mortality rates remained elevated in 2016, also about 6 or 7%. So a lot of trees died following this drought. The interesting thing is that not all species of trees seem to be vulnerable to this drought. This graph with lots of bars shows the mortality rate for a bunch of different species at our study sites. And what we see is that some species on the left-hand side of the graph here experience extremely high mortality rates in the face of this drought. Over 50% even of the individuals of certain species died. And so these we consider to be highly vulnerable to drought. But there's also almost half of the species that didn't suffer any mortality at all associated with this most severe drought that we've observed in about 40 years at this site. And so some species seem to be very vulnerable. Other species seem to be very resistant to drought. And we've been able to correlate the vulnerability of plants to drought with certain hydraulic traits related to their stomatal functioning. And so we find that the trees that are very conservative and that close their stomata at the slightest sign of a drought are the ones that survive the severe drought. And the trees that are more aggressive and are betting that the drought is going to end soon and don't close their stomata in order to try to be greedy and get a little bit more carbon dioxide, those are exactly the ones that die in the face of this severe drought. Okay, so now I'll move on to some more observational evidence from the Amazon. And this graph indicates quite a number of study sites spread throughout the Amazon, some of which have been making measurements since the early 1980s. The context for this analysis are two droughts that occurred in 2005 and 2010. 2005 drought in the Amazon was at that time the strongest drought on record. And so this was considered a really severe drought. 5 years later, the 2010 drought comes along, and that takes over as the strongest drought on record. And then I don't have it shown here, but there was also a drought associated with the 2015 El Nino. So here's the observed tree mortality from those forest plots in the Amazon. I think we could just put aside the first part of the time series because data were very, very limited. They had far fewer plots in the 1980s than afterwards. And we could ask ourselves if this time series reveals spikes in mortality associated with the extreme droughts in 2005 and 2010. And you really would have to squint, I think, to see that it does. There are, I think, small anomalies associated with 2005 and 2010, but they're completely obscured by this overall upward trend in mortality over the past few decades. And this upward trend in mortality is puzzling. I could speculate on why that is, but I don't think that anybody really has a great explanation for that. Okay. So now on to some experimental evidence of tree mortality and drought. And the experiments are carried out like this. You could set up panels in your forest, as this photo tries to indicate, so that when rain comes down and falls through the forest canopy, it will hit these panels and then run off into these little gullies that will redirect the water to some hopefully distant location. And as a result, the soil underneath these panels is hopefully going to be if the experiment works, going to be drier than the soil surrounding these panels in the outside environment. And so we hope to create an artificial drought with this kind of setup. And so this was first done in the Amazon in the early 2000s. And at that time, they were able to achieve soil water reductions of about 20%. And that reduction in soil water of 20% was associated in large increases in tree mortality over about 8 years of this experiment. The control plots had mortality rates between 0 and 3% per year. The droughted plots had mortality rates between 3 and 12% per year. And so this was presented as some evidence that even a 20% in soil moisture could result in elevated tree mortality. But again, we get the same sort of story where not all tree species were affected by this experiment. In fact, many tree species had no significant mortality response to this artificial drought. But there were also many tree species that were responsive. And so this is suggesting that tropical forests may be seeing a change in composition if drought does come throughout the rest of the century. Unfortunately, we don't know the hydraulic traits of most of these species, and that's something that we're actively working on measuring. Another thing that has come out of this and in other studies is that there's some suggestion that bigger trees are more likely to die following drought than smaller trees, and we've been trying to understand why the large trees tend to be more vulnerable. Okay. The final piece of the talk is modeling evidence for tree mortality following drought. And the modeling evidence that I'm going to present is based on mechanistic models, where we take inputs like observed plant traits and observed meteorology and observed soils, and we throw that into some computer code. These computer codes could be quite complex, 100,000 lines of code or so. And then these computer models are supposed to represent the state of our knowledge of photosynthesis and respiration and mortality and growth and all the mechanisms that make trees and forests work. And what these models then predict are the composition of ecosystems, the size structure of ecosystems, what species of trees, how much biomass is held in these sorts of ecosystems. And so you could force these models with relatively dry scenarios and relatively wet scenarios and see how mortality differs between the dry and the wet scenarios. And so one of the tests that was recently done was to see whether these models could accurately simulate the throughfall exclusion experiment that I mentioned on a few slides ago. And unfortunately, the answer to that is no. Models have failed utterly to replicate these experiments. The observations are shown in the open points. There's a big cluster of model simulations showing zero mortality in the colored lines, and so they were unable to predict that observed mortality. There was one model, on the other hand, that predicted about twice as much mortality than was observed. And so this is something that we're actively trying to sort out. And we think that the main issue with the models here is that all of these models predate most of the measurements of plant hydraulic traits, and they don't include plant hydraulic traits in their models. And so we're actively making those measurements and trying to now get them included into models. And so what's hot now in the community is this MODEX idea, integrating models and experiments, where modelers and field ecologists get together and talk about what's needed and how to create synergy and moving forward, and also incorporating more mechanistic plant hydraulic processes and hydraulic traits into models. And to give you just a taste of some recent advances, though I won't be able to go into the details, are that the latest models have been able to explain why big trees have suffered more than small trees when faced with droughts. And that's, again, that's based on the differences in hydraulic traits. And we've also been able to simulate different species responses to seasonal droughts in seasonal tropical forests. We've been able to explain why some trees are deciduous in terms of seasonal drought and why some trees remain evergreen. Okay, and so just to summarize, we have some observational evidence that recent droughts have killed a relatively large number of tropical trees. We see this more in Central America and Costa Rica than we have in the Amazon, although there is some slight effect in the Amazon. There are other mortality factors likely to be important, that overall trend in the Amazon that we can't explain. In terms of experimental droughts, we see that they have also substantially resulted in elevated tree mortality, but the effect's species dependent. Our mechanistic models have struggled to simulate the observations, but we think that increasing knowledge of plant traits, plant hydraulic traits, will help us there. And so I think the message coming out of this is that these tropical trees, some species are hydraulically vulnerable, others aren't. We'll probably see shifts in species composition over the next decades if these types of droughts continue. And then finally, maybe to follow up a bit on even a question from the last talk, what are we to do in the face of these potential ecological changes that we're seeing here? What kinds of actions that could we take? It's a question I get asked a lot by my students, and I don't know what the answer to that is, unfortunately, but I've been trying to have conversations about it at least. And in particular, I'm also at the same time trying to figure out how to better incorporate my Catholic faith in my teaching. And so all of these things sort of came together last semester where I did a course where we combined the science of climate change with what Catholics ought to do about climate change. And so if you have any sort of pedagogical interest in that area, I'd love to hear what kind of advice you might have. And so that's all. I'm happy to take questions.